Welcome to the Surfcast Podcast, your weekly source for surf fishing discussions, tactics, interviews, news, and more. The Surfcast Podcast is hosted by Jerry Audet and Toby Lapinski, two of the most dedicated and obsessed surf fishermen that you will ever meet. The tide is up, the wind is at our back, so let's hit the surf. Welcome to the next episode of the Surfcast Podcast. I am Toby Lapinski.
And I'm Jerry Audet, and today we're going to be talking about bioluminescence, or fire in the water, as it's often known as. Really quickly before we talk about the meat and potatoes of this, about how to deal with it and what we think about it, what is it? Well, bioluminescence is just microorganisms in the water. It's plankton, which are plants, and it's zooplankton, which are little animals. And, that's the bioluminescence, the fire in the water you see that's like speckled through the water. The bright flashes you see can be all kinds of different stuff, from jellyfish to squid, all kinds of different things make the big flashes. But we're really talking about the really small stuff that's spread throughout the whole water, that as you walk through the water, as you drag your lure through the water, you can see it sort of flashing everywhere. And it does this in response to being hassled, to being moved, to being hit physically. It flashes, and biologists think it's a defense mechanism. And that's why you really only see it if something's moving through it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's an interesting subject. It's the same stuff in across all the different organisms, which is kind of neat that it's getting everything from sharks to plankton to algae, everything else in there. It's the same basic process. I also found kind of interesting when I was trying to figure out what the heck this stuff was to talk about today. Some organisms even triggered by light levels. So if it's a bright day, it's not going to kick into gear, but if it's an overcast day, potentially it could. And obviously once the sun sets and you reach dusk, it's definitely going to. So other than the fact that it's just bright out, that could be a factor why you don't see it under brighter conditions. Potentially why we don't really notice it so often on those bright moon nights. It's primarily just those darker nights, the nights when you're psyched to be out there, and then you run into it. You see the fire in the water, usually not to great pleasure.
Yeah, that's right. And I think a lot of guys don't understand that it's just a plankton bloom. It's an algae bloom in a lot of ways. It's just our own version of that. You hear a lot about the bad algae blooms down south. We don't really get that so much up here, although we do in some places, but not in saltwater quite so much. But that's really what this is. And that's why you see it a lot more around certain moons and certain times of the year than other times of the year. I often see it in August and September. How about you, Toby?
Yeah, it definitely seems like the warmer time of the season, warmer water. That August into September, it's like those nights when you're starting to really get back into the surf. The fall run is kicking into gear. You're psyched. Yes, we got a nice dark night. You get out there, your second, third night, you didn't see anything, and then it hits, and it's just like your heart sinks. But because it's those fishy nights, the fishy time of the season, it happens to be more prevalent.
That's right. So, Toby, it sounds like you really kind of don't like it. Is that right?
I definitely don't like to see it. I'm not happy when I get there. I've also always kind of figured it to be more of, I'm always looking for a reason, excuse, whatever you want to swing it for, while I do well, while I do poorly. And obviously, if you do poorly, the easiest answer is the most obvious on a given night. So if it's a dark night, but there's a ton of fire in the water, you don't catch, it's real easy to just fall onto, there's fire in the water. It wasn't some other factor. It wasn't something you did wrong. It wasn't the fact there was no bait, that there was no fish. So I have a hard time not automatically going there the moment I get to the surf and I see it in the water. I'm wading out and it's lighting up on my rod. It's lighting up on the rocks. I'm seeing the waves crash. So I would not say that I'm a fan of it by any means.
Yeah, I feel the same way. I think that bioluminescence is one of my least favorite things. Mung might be the only thing that's potentially worse, but I'll take weedy, cloudy, dirty, sandy, all kinds of different conditions over bioluminescence. It's one of my least favorite things, and I think when it gets really bad, there's just really nothing you can do. I mean, if it's a 10 out of 10 bad, I really, really struggle to come up with things that will work. Now, this gets to something you just said, though. If 10 out of 10 is the worst it can be, and 0 out of 10 is nothing, when it's a 4 or a 5, your confidence plays a huge role in the surf, plays a huge role in fishing in general. And if you think bioluminescence is an issue and you see some of it, you're not going to fish as hard. If you don't get some action, you might not stay as late. You might avoid an area where, oh, it's usually good. Oh, no, there's bioluminescence. Well, I'm going to go somewhere else because maybe it's not worth it. So it sort of pushes you in one direction or the other. And I think for me specifically, that definitely plays a role. I start to get, if I'm supposed to stay for 2.5 hours for the window, I might only stay for 2 hours if I see a 4 out of 5 or a 6 out of 10, 4 out of 10 or a 6 out of 10 level of bad. You know what I mean?
Absolutely, because in reality, it's a naturally occurring phenomenon. So it's something that the fish have experienced before. It's not like that night's the first time it ever happened. So
that's right.
They're used to seeing it. It's not an unnatural light source that is suddenly showing up on it. So you really should be able to work through it. It might not produce the best results, but the more I at least try to tell myself this, if I'm trying to stick it out and not bail within a few minutes and not let my confidence, tank immediately, it is something they're going to see. The striped bass, the fish that we're targeting in the surf, they've experienced it many times before, so they're not likely just going to not eat because of it. Maybe if there's extremes of it, it could turn them off enough, but when I'm fighting that mental back and forth game in my head, that's the kind of thing I'm thinking of, that if I can just figure out what to present to them, how to present it to them, I can work with this, what I've got, what these conditions are to produce something that looks natural enough for them to still eat. So it's one of those, it's definitely a mental game or challenge.
That's right. And I mean, I will say the number of good nights I've had when there's been bioluminescence is a lot less than bad, but I've certainly had nights that were good. How about you?
Yes, it's absolutely, which is why I kind of think, I mentioned a moment ago, I kind of use it as like that easy excuse for when it is bad, that maybe it's not just that, because I've had some okay nights, I've had some pretty good nights, and I've had some really good nights when it was there. Granted, by having to modify my techniques a little bit. I couldn't go, if night one, there was none of it, did well. Night two, I come and everything, all other factors considered are the same except for the bioluminescence. The fish should still be there, so I just try to watch what I'm letting myself buy into and fall into excuses on, but it still can be good.
Yeah, and so one of my things that I want to point out to the listeners, and I'm sure you've already thought of this too, is that if it's plankton and it's, life, it's potentially going to draw something that's going to eat it, right? And so it can be the basis of the food chain. And if you have a lot of bioluminescence, if you've got a lot of fire in the water, you're someplace where that's accumulating. Now, of course, we've been in situations, both of us, where you've got a lot of current in front of you and it's just running by in front of you and like it's not accumulating, it's streaming by, right? That's a little bit different. But that means that somewhere nearby it's accumulated. Now, of course, I've been in situations too where, oh my gosh, one night me and my friend Robin were walking along the beach and we would take steps on the sand and we were, 3 or 4 feet apart and the bioluminescence would connect between us. It was like something out of, Avatar or something. It was wild, right?
Uh-huh.
And in that particular night, the whole beach was just miles of just unbelievable bioluminescence. But we actually did catch quite a few fish over those couple of nights. It was really fun. Nothing huge, but we had fish into the 20-pound range or so, and it was really fun. But in some of my spots, if I see a lot of bioluminescence, it's because this is a place where stuff accumulates, life accumulates, and then it builds from there. So stuff's feeding on the plankton, feeding the zooplankton, then it gets to be small minnows, and it keeps going up and up and up and up. So, and we'll talk about weedy water many times, and I'm sure we'll have a whole separate podcast about it. But in the same way I view accumulations of weed, I view it with the bioluminescence too. This is a place where stuff is accumulating, and that's going to attract stripers. So if you can fish it, and you can figure out a way to fish it, it could really signify an eddy, a back current, a seam, something like that. All of those classic things that we look for. That's how I feel about it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, certainly. It's a lot of these places that we're finding it, I'm finding it, are in my consistent spots to begin with. So I think those are factors that are in there. So again, it's not something out of the ordinary. You're at a right place. If you're finding the start of the food chain, which is eventually going to build up to the apex predator that you're targeting, you've done something right to get yourself there. So why bail on it or give up or throw in a towel just because there's this one naturally occurring factor going on that just makes you need to think a little bit deeper to potentially unlock the keys to success on that given outing.
That's right. So, thinking deeper, Toby, let's dig in a little bit to what we do. So, what are you thinking? Like, how do you handle it? I've heard all kinds of different theories, and I'll give my own and you'll give your own, but, it's tough, right? So what do you do?
Mm-hmm. My approach to it has changed over the years. It's always changing. Even as recently as literally a week before we recorded tonight, ran into it. So it's never something that I think I've got figured out. But my baseline, when I see it in the water, the first thing I do is something that is going to disturb less water. Meaning not a rapidly vibrating plastic-lipped minnow, bomber, redfin, SP minnow, not something like that. Because my idea, or my thought process here is it's shaking back and forth. You're more likely to come in contact with more of the plankton, whatever it is that's lighting up. So you're disturbing more. So if I go away from that, now I'm thinking lures that slide through the water a little bit more, needlefish, bucktail, some metal lips that more glide and have a not a wiggle, but more of a wobble-ish to them. Things along those lines. And also not lures that I'm going to suddenly dart real quick, like a darter. If I fish a darter, it's more of a slow and steady retrieve so that it's just doing its swim through the water versus my normal darter retrieve, which I add pops into. Because again, I'm thinking that if I do that extra pop, that jerk, I'm going to shoot it into more of the fire. It's going to light up more versus just kind of hopefully sliding around it and not contacting as much. Now, again, it doesn't work all the time, but that's the start. When I first see it, that's where I go to begin my approach on the night.
Yeah, so, Toby, that's interesting because I totally agree with you. When you are looking at bait fish moving through the water when there's bioluminescence, you don't know they're there until you disturb them. So I've been in lots of situations where sand eels specifically, they're all over, but you don't know they're there until you're stepping through them and they're shooting away and creating little shooting stars, little meteorites. I've also had the same experience with smaller stripers, schoolies, maybe a little bit bigger than that, where I don't realize there's fish there until I walk into the water or I'm walking along the shore, and all of a sudden they zoom away and they create a shooting star, right? A flash of light. And so everything's still moving around. It's not like everything's totally still in the water, right? It's still moving gently through the water, not disrupting this bioluminescence. It's trying to hide, right? Mm-hmm. So you moving your lure along gently, quietly, calmly is very natural. Now, that being said, I've been working on a theory this year that seems to actually be working out because over a few nights, it really seemed to work. And that's that I was using a glider. It's a pretty active plug, swims back and forth, and we'll talk lots about gliders because I love them. But this one was a swimming one, so it goes back and forth, back and forth, back and forth on a straight retrieve. And what I found is I needed to go fast, and then I needed to go really, really fast. Like that. That's my real handle going around. So really fast. And usually I would get hit somewhere in there when I started to go fast or when I stopped. I would really, really fast and I would stop. And that's a fairly common thing that can work, and other times it's not just a bioluminescence thing. But what I think was happening in this particular case is, again, when your lure is moving through bioluminescence and it's moving fairly slowly or moderately slow, as we often say, but it's still lighting everything up, that doesn't make any sense. It's totally unnatural, right? But if that thing, which is your lure, that looks like a fleeing bait fish or squid or an eel or whatever it is, zooming through the water, it should light up, right? That's natural. It should be lighting up. So I think in that way, you're almost overriding the effect of the bioluminescence because it's supposed to be lighting up. It's supposed to be bright. And so that's something I found more recently. that I hadn't really used. I will say for me in particular, I have really been working a lot harder on using some faster retrieves in general. And we're going to talk all about that some other time. But I've been trying to vary my retrieve speeds even more than I've done in the past, just to work on another skill that maybe I feel like I could get better at. And this is kind of what happened in this particular case. Now, I also say the water is fairly shallow, so part of it, of going a little bit faster, serendipity, is just I'm trying to keep it off the bottom. So that's kind of how it started. But that's something I've seen. And, I want to raise a point here before I throw back to you for a second. Before I forget, I actually think the lure might matter a little bit less. I think the line makes a big difference in terms of lighting up. And I've heard lots of guys say, in bioluminescence, you got to go down a liter. You got to drop it down from 50 to 30 or 20. You got to make it thinner. But I think that's all BS. I don't agree with that at all. I think braid lights up the bioluminescence incredible. And, whether you're using 30 or 50, you're using 6, 8, 10-pound test equivalent. So your liter makes no real difference. And I've heard lots of people say, oh, you got to go down a liter. Oh, you got to use fluorocarbon. It's not going to make any difference if it's moving through. And I think that's one of the things you're trying to overcome as well. And it's really hard. It's really hard.
Oh, yeah. Yeah, the leader thing is, just recently when I was out, and I always test a lure when I first clip a lure on, regardless of what it is, where I am. If I can see in the water at all without my light, I give it a swing just to make sure it swims right, it's moving right. If it's in a place where I can flip my light on quickly, safely, check, I'll do it as well. And on that recent night with it, I noticed right off the bat, obviously I was wading out and I saw a lot of fire. Put a plug on and I pulled it through the water and I saw the lure wiggling and I saw 2 feet of line in front of it light up. And I still took a couple of casts, but right away I immediately was like, this is not going to be a good night. If I'm lighting up my 8-inch plug and 2 feet of line coming off it at a sharp angle, this is just not going to be a positive. I had already, like I said, I already knew there was fire in there, so I did my first step of going to a lure that wasn't going to move a whole lot. I was going to a deep dive in metal lip in this case, because this will get down. You don't have to crank it really hard. It's got a slow wobble. But I threw in the second consideration I make when I'm trying to combat the fire is I go with a rather dark plug. Now, in the first place, you're seeing the fire on dark nights, so I have a tendency to lean towards dark plugs on dark nights to begin with. Started throwing this idea around and haven't really tested it back and forth too hard, but my thought would be maybe if it's a white plug and it lights up, it's going to shine more. Whereas if it's a black plug, maybe a flat or a matte paint, it's going to reflect a little less. So maybe, I'm hoping, it's not going to show as much light to the fish unnaturally in the water. So that's where I started that night. It didn't work. And I had to slowly begin to develop a different approach as I went to my 2 go-tos: less action, darker plug, and I had nothing. But obviously, in response to the fact that we knew we were going to be discussing this, I'll get to where I went with it shortly. But it made me continue to think, what are some other ways to combat it, sort of on the fly. And much like you and I do a lot of times, if we're doing really well, we change up stuff a lot to see if we can improve or fine-tune the bite even better. I do the same thing on bad nights. So this was a great opportunity to force me to stay, to see if I could figure things out, learn something from it. Even if I didn't find success, try to make it a learning experience.
That's right.
What is there a color tendency that you have, a thought process you have in regards to there being this fire in the water?
So it's really interesting. I'm not sure we're going to have a talk where we have so many discordant thoughts where we're not agreeing with each other so much, because you and I tend to agree on a lot of stuff. And I agree with you in this case in one particular way and disagree very strongly in another. I do think dark plugs are a better choice. I'm a big fan of chartreuse and white and yellow over white, but I think in this particular case, I like a darker plug for the same reason. With the huge exception, I like flashy plugs. And I'm talking flash. So it has to be something like a chrome redfin is a great example to look at. Now, I'm not sure I would be choosing a redfin, actually, because that's one of the worst choices, because it's very active. It's right on the surface, which chances are there's more bioluminescence up than down. Also, they don't cast super far. Again, remember, a lot of bioluminescence might be close to you, and even though you can see it, there might not be so much out there, far away from you, right? So that's something to consider too. But those chrome redfins, a lot of us have seen. There's a lot of very flashy SP minnows too you've seen, but they have to be flashy. Now, forget all those plugs though. That's not what I like, but I'm trying to use examples of things that I do like. There are some gliders and some other plugs that are fully mirror chrome flashy. Okay? Again, gliders come to mind. That's one of the ones I like. My theory with this is nascent. I'm not very far along the path with this, but I have had some experience in recent years where the chrome plug did better than a flat color of anything, dark or bright. And really briefly, my theory on this is that if you think of, as a metaphor, the bioluminescence is like a hum, like something like that, and it's driving you crazy, right? Like it's like you can't get it out of your head. You hear it everywhere, right? What could you do to drown that out? Well, you could put on some music, right? So if it's not very loud, you can put on a little bit of, classical music. But if it's really loud, you got to put on some heavy metal. You got to turn the volume way up, way overpower that hum, and now you can't hear it. Now, of course, it's really loud, and for humans, it would be deafening. But let's not take the analogy that far, right? Instead, I think that flashing chrome plug maybe just overpowers the bioluminescence, and it's flashing so much that it overpowers potentially the effect on the line or the effects that the lure makes, etc. I'm not sure, except that it seems to be real. That seems to be something that's been repeatable enough to be a real effect in my mind. Again, there's not a ton of plugs that reflect, that are subsurface, that don't have a lip. That's the problem. So gliders, of course, are one of my favorites, but there's, and I haven't tested this, but I've just been thinking about it because of the podcast, there are some soft plastics that are very reflective. Sluggo has some options, and there's some other ones that are like super silvery bright. So something interesting potentially to try. And of course, what's flashier than a tin? And there's not a lot of guys using metal at night anymore, which is an interesting theory that I haven't tried out.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, when you said that with the chrome flashy type stuff, I was cycling through my mental inventory. I'm like, no, yeah, there's not a ton of stuff comes right to mind that are your standard surf plugs that have that kind of a finish.
That's right, because if it's bright, that's something totally different, and it's irrelevant, right? It can be a parent darter. It doesn't matter. That's irrelevant. It could be the brightest shade of day glow, whatever, and it doesn't matter, because that's not the same as reflective. And I think that's really a key distinction. So, yeah. So, Toby, I think that's about all of my thoughts. Do you have anything else you wanted to say about bioluminescence?
Yeah, I mean, I can get into the last point here, just that I referenced there a moment ago, what I sort of developed on the fly the other day. So it doesn't have a lot of testing behind it, but when I was forced to try a little bit more and not give up, because honestly, I probably would have called it pretty quickly that night, because there was just an absurd amount of fire in the water. I mean, the most I'd seen all year.
It's been bad. It's been exceptional this year, I will say.
And it was 3-4 nights in a row. It stayed. It got less. It lessened as it went along. It could have been conditions. The water got a little dirtier, whatever. But I mean, that night, 100 times before, I've quit after 15 minutes seeing that. But I said, you know what? I know we're going to be talking on this soon. Let's try a couple of things. So I took that, trying to move my lure less, that soft movement through the water, calmly coming through, and I looked at what I had and tried to figure out what's the extreme of what I've got with me that I can go there. So the first thing I grabbed was a 12-inch Sluggo. I'm like, all right, this thing is just gonna slide through the water. Took a couple of casts. I did my normal retrieve, which is slow retrieve with some pops here and there, but I tried to dial my extra action back, those jerks, to get it to move, and nothing really happened. I tried a couple of just dead drift swinging it, nothing really happened. But I was dealing with a little bit deeper water than this was probably I wasn't able to get where I wanted to in the water column. So my next thing on me was a 13-inch rubber eel with a small jig head, my 1/2 ounce to 3/4 heads that I love to use. And like, all right, I can throw this. I know it's going to get in the range of the bottom, so I'm going to be putting into the strike zone if there's fish here. Right. Normally, I would give it a little bit of action as I'm retrieving it. I said, let's just put it out there and almost do a dead drift. So I am just retrieving fast enough to stay in contact, to sense what's going on, so that at either hitting bottom or getting a fish, I can react. So I first cast, I believe on the first cast I had a hit with this. Could have been obviously dumb luck that the fish just arrived at the very same time. Got that fish in, fine. Repeated it. Another fish. I think I had 3 fish in a row to start. 2 or 3, maybe 3 on the first 4. Now I'm repeating this same process where just letting that lure slide with the current. It is just coming along perhaps at or about the same speed as the water is going, getting into the strike zone. I'm not aggravating any unnatural amount of phosphorescence. It's not lighting up any more than the striped bass would naturally be seeing as bait and things come drifting by them. And I was able to repeat this for the rest of the night. I would then switch it out though. Thinking to myself, well, again, did I just happen to hit the exact timing where the fish moved in and they were ready? I got 1 hit the rest of the night on any other plugs. And I threw everything from the stuff I would normally throw with fire to the stuff that I would not throw. I tried to really beat the idea to death to figure it out, to see if it was something. And granted, it was only the first night I tried this. I consciously tried this technique. It was enough to make me then say, this is something I'm going to stick to, which I then repeated the next night and the third night in sequence on it. And again, it is a very small sample size. It is 3 tides specifically trying this. But on all of them, I was, like I said, trying to counter it, trying the opposite lures, trying other stuff. Granted, as the days progressed, the water got dirty. There was a little less visible fire, and I did start to catch a little bit on other stuff. But I mean, it was a 3-to-1, 4-to-1 ratio of success. So I've now got another trick to employ and continue to research as I go along. If this is, this could, right now, this is jumping to my first tactic when I run into fire. Go this route before I worry about a black lure or a slow swimming metal lip or anything along those lines. So that's where I'm at with that theory right now.
Yeah, and I think there's a bigger lesson there, which is that, even though you and I agree that we see bioluminescence, we see fire in the water, our confidence is shattered. That there often are fish there. Mm-hmm. There's fish there more often than we think, I think, and that if you can figure out a way to catch them, to feed them in the right way, they will eat, essentially, right? And versus that they're just completely shut off or that there's no fish there, which I couldn't disagree with more, that it won't scare the fish away. So I think that's a great thought, Toby. I think that's something really to get everyone to think about.
Yeah, I was, again, I was happy to have pieced that thing in, and it's something I'm going to completely continue. And I'm sure now, somewhere down the road, a year from now, we'll follow up again on this because I'm going to put more work on it. I'm going to, love to find out what some of the listeners have come across. What this, whenever I talk to other people about fire, more often than not, they don't even bother to try to fish through it. And I'm sure some of the surfcasters out there have some tricks that work consistently enough. So it's interesting to see. It'd be interesting to see what they've got, and especially because right off the bat, we had some contrasting ideas on it, which that kind of stuff always intrigues me. Being that while neither of us has, great success with it, you've had success with your stuff. I've had success with mine. Some of them don't line up. So it's just, there's no single answers. So
that's right. I completely agree. So we'll leave that up to people to send in some comments. We'll see what happens, and we'll revisit this topic maybe in a year or something.
Yeah.
This has been a weekly edition of the Surfcast Podcast. You can find out more about the podcast and find more episodes at surfcastpodcast.com. And be sure to check us out on social media at the Surfcast Podcast.